Okay. Well, as they come in, I will be filtering them out. But I'll go ahead and get this workshop started. So thank you, my tutors, for attending Writing in History. I know that a couple of you guys in the past and currently are working with students who bring in assignments from history courses, right? And you guys have some questions or you guys would like to hear from an expert within that particular field. And today we have Dr. Julia Ornelas-Higdon, who is going to talk a bit more about how writing is conducted within the field of history, and answer any of your questions when it comes to supporting those types of students, especially here at CSUCI. So I'm going to go ahead and give the mic to our wonderful guest speaker.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Sophie. Thanks for the invitation to come. It's really a delight. And thanks to all of you tutors. We faculty see your work. We appreciate your work. I myself can tell a difference when I'm evaluating essays and I have a student who says, oh, I went to the WMC versus students who don't. So thank you for all the work you do. I prepared a slide deck, if that's okay, just to help keep me on track. But if at any point, you all have questions or comments, or you want me to share, focus on something in particular, I'm more than happy to do that. This is your time. So I want to do that. Okay. So I wanted to start with a bit of, I want to know who you all are. So some introductions, if you all could just, the writing tutors, if you could let me know your name, your year, and your major, and perhaps something you know about writing in history or history assignments or a question. Maybe we could start with Emma.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Emma. This is my last semester, so I'm gonna be graduating. I'm an English major. Um, and I've actually taken, I think, like two history courses here just for like credits and stuff. And one thing I noticed, at least in the way that the professor that I was working with did it, was there was really an emphasis on diversifying your sources. So most of our writing assignments in that class were you had like a primary source and a secondary source. And if you had like more, you would prefer more primary sources. And so we went a lot into like how to get those sources through our
Yeah,
library resources and things like that.
thanks, Emma. Kira?
Yes, that was right. I'm an ESRN major. I'm a senior, but I have an extra semester, and I only took one history course, and it was dance and history and culture, and it was like my first semester here, so I don't really know much. But
It's all good. I've heard great things about that class. Maddie.
Hello, my name is Madison, or I go by Maddie as well. I'm in this ESRM major also, and it's been about a year or two since I've taken a history class. It was when I first transferred here to CI. I transferred from SBCC, so Santa Barbara City College. So I guess I'm a super senior. I've got another year left. But I thought it was really interesting. The history course in college versus high school went into a lot more
Mhm.
depth, and it definitely left me curious to learn more.
Yeah, we can tell you about all the things that they deem inappropriate for the K-12 kids. Um, thanks, Maddie. Alba?
Yes, Alva. Hi, I'm Alva. I actually graduated from Channel Islands a couple years ago, but my major was
Huh.
anthropology, and I'm in the master's program for anthropology at CSUN right now. And I do quite like history. I actually also had a minor in global pre-modern studies, so I took quite a few history classes as part of that in my undergrad. And one of the things that I really got out of those history classes was how much who writes that history really influences like how we think about things and what stories are told and what is valuable from those stories.
Thank you for sharing that, Alba. I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to AI because it really does matter. something that's amplified right now with the technology. And then Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I am a liberal studies major. I'm also getting my certificate in Spanish translation. This is my last year. I'm a super senior, so I'm a fifth year. History, I feel like I've always had a component of history throughout my whole like academic career, especially with like the history of the educational system. I've taken a lot of like different history classes, which I've really enjoyed. And I feel like it's just really like, I feel like I've just taken it throughout my whole career and I've just really enjoyed it. And there's a lot of like negative and positive things that happen. So I think it's always good to like compare them to what's going on today.
Isn't that the truth? It certainly helps. History helps us understand how we got to the present moment for sure. Thank you for indulging me with those introductions. It's very helpful to hear your own backgrounds. All right, so I'm going to dive in here. I've got, an outline of points I want to emphasize, but at any point, if you are, dying to know more, you have a question, you want clarification, please stop me. I love questions and discussions. Okay, so I wanted to start with something very basic, talking about the different genres and formats of writing that history students at Channel Islands may embark on. So, first of all, I think, Emma, you mentioned this already. Our writing, our evidence comes from primary and secondary sources. So primary sources are sources that were created at the time of the topic we're studying. And, common examples are newspapers, old letters, diaries, but they can be published materials and they can be relatively recent. For example, if a student is writing a history of presidential elections and the Electoral College, and they want to include a narrative of all presidential elections across American history, and they pull, a newspaper article from the 2020 election, even though that's very recent, it is a primary source topic because it is about it was created during the period that the historian, the scholar is studying. Secondary sources are textbooks, books, articles, scholarly monographs, that sort of thing, that are written by someone who has interpreted primary sources for you already. So perhaps the student writing this term paper about presidential elections looks to a newspaper article or journal article that offers an analysis of voter participation data on 20th century presidential elections. Even though that the data in there might be a primary source, it's already been interpreted for them by a scholar. Therefore, it is a secondary sources. So in our classes, students will read both kinds of sources to understand their, oh, thank you. Thank you for letting me know, Sophie. I picked the wrong thing. It's clearly a morning where I should have had more coffee. Let's try this again. There we go. Are we seeing a slide deck now? Cool. There we are. Okay. So that's the evidence that students draw from to draft their essays in history courses. Next, I want to talk about the lower division versus upper division writing. My hunch is, based on my own teaching experience, that most of the students who go to the WMC for writing help tend to be upper division students. And that's because most of our classes are upper division. We're a transfer heavy major, so we have very few lower division courses. But correct me if I'm wrong. Have any of you worked with history students in like the United States history surveys or the world history surveys? Okay, so some trickle in. But the big differences are that, and this is probably something that you would guess, lower division students where they're getting their feet wet with history, research, and writing. So their assignments tend to be shorter, less intensive. They're more directed versus an open form research project where they pick the topic and design a research question and execute that research on their own. Usually they're given a prompt or a provocation and very clear instructions and a scaffolded assignment. And I would say with upper division courses, we scaffold things very much. So you may see students coming in with, needing assistance on drafting research questions and a thesis statement, help with an outline perhaps, assistance with an annotated bibliography. So those scaffolded assignments may come your way as well. In addition to research type projects, which I'm getting ahead of myself down there, a lot of our classes assign midterm and analytical essays. And I should, give that a caveat because with AI, the generative writing, some of our faculty are switching back to blue books. But the convention in our department has been, by and large, to give students the time and space to analyze the sources through a written essay, to do that at home with, ample opportunity versus the pressure of a written in-class exam. But you may have students who bring in a prompt and a draft and need assistance with that. And then the last thing I'll talk about are response papers. So these are a little bit more casual, they're more informal, often a bit shorter. They might ask for a reflection on a documentary and the connections to class themes. It might be a reflection paper on a guest speaker or a field trip, that sort of thing. They might be a little bit more personal. So I doubt students would bring those in, but you may see that here and there. And then, of course, the research projects that I talked about. And with the research projects, the big culminating experience in our major is History 499 and History 492. 492 is internship, 499 is capstone, and that is the one where students produce a 20-page paper or a podcast. I'm teaching that this spring, and my students are producing podcasts. But our capstone students tend to be pretty heavy WMC users. They tend to need a lot of support, a lot of peer review, and we work that into the class. But many of them still go to the WMC. They tend to be very driven, very motivated. And the scale of the project is so large where they are really designing a project from scratch, embarking on primary and secondary source research, and producing this large scale product that they might use to apply to graduate school or as part of a portfolio. So they take the work very seriously. Any questions before I move on? Comments, anything like that? Okay. So I'm going to walk you through just some really basic things that I think I like to remind students about and maybe helpful for you as you get people trickling into your offices. So a lot of this is basic, but you'd be amazed on the assessment side how often we will get an assignment that's beautifully written but doesn't really do the assignment. So it's super basic, but so helpful to remind students. So I asked them, step one, with all the writing, are you doing what is assigned of you? So this is just encouraging students to read the instructions very carefully. Ask if they have been told to write an argumentative thesis or an expository thesis. in history, the convention by and large is argumentative thesis. But sometimes, we'll get students who, like, especially liberal studies students who have to, they're taking classes across the university. I think it's one of the hardest majors on campus where they have to become a jack of all trades. So they're bringing their writing training from English, from political science, and they might need a little bit more encouragement and reminder to write an argumentative thesis versus an expository thesis, i.e., an expository thesis might be in this essay, I will discuss the causes and consequences of the Civil War. An argumentative thesis would say, of the Civil War, and some of the key consequences were, I don't know, the Reconstruction Amendments. So, really encouraging them to give it all up front in the thesis, in that argumentative thesis. And then, reminding them to use sources and evidence as they were instructed. And this is just pausing, looking at the assignment. If it says find 3 primary sources and 4 secondary sources from the library, is that included? If it says use only sources assigned in class, are they doing that? So it's just gentle reminders. Questions? Are these things that you all see when you have students coming in? Yeah, a little bit. Okay, so let's get into the heart of the matter. Sure, the key components of the history essay, and I'm emphasizing thesis and argument because they really matter so much in our discipline. One thing, a simple way that I explain thesis to students is it's where you tell your reader very clearly what you are going to argue. It can be one sentence, but sometimes students get really tripped up with that and they have more to say. And I tell them, like in history, for a scholar who's writing a book, an argument can be laid out over an entire chapter. In an article, an argument might take up a paragraph or two. The thesis statement, I should say, I misspoke. So in an essay, it is perfectly okay if a thesis statement needs to be 2, maybe 3 sentences. Not a whole paragraph, but it's okay to give them that freedom to expand if they need it, if it makes it easier in terms of wordsmithing and clarity to break it up into a couple sentences. That is always okay. I encourage them to use the thesis statement to answer the question in the prompt they've been given, or to address their research question, the one that they've drafted for their own research projects. And this framework of using the thesis to answer a question is often more straightforward than trying to grasp at this nebulous concept of a thesis statement. It can be very overwhelming for our undergrads to state an argumentative thesis. It's scary, right? And this gives them a format, an outline to follow to start drafting their thesis. It might evolve, it might become more sophisticated, but it's a great starting point. And then the other thing I do to clarify about thesis versus argument is thesis is where you tell your reader what you are going to argue. The argument is the structure by which you prove that thesis. It's all the evidence that you build in the essay to support that thesis statement. Questions about thesis and argument? Okay. So I'm going to talk about topic sentences. And I know topic sentences it's not a sexy topic, right? It's not exciting when we hear topic sentences. I mean, I don't know about you, but I go back to my high school English class, and the particular instructors I had were drilling into us the importance of topic sentences. And I don't know if that's still the convention in K-12 education, but I do know from our colleagues in the English department that topic sentences are something of discussion in the composition classes, and there's good reason for it. They matter. They matter. They're a very clear structural way by which a writer can connect the evidence in the paragraph that follows back up to that thesis statement, right? So back to my Civil War essay example, I could just pull something out of my head here. Could say something like, the Compromise of 1850 and the I don't know, the addition of California to the Union disrupted the balance of enslaved and free states and amplified sectional divisions. As a reader, I now know from that sentence that the evidence that follows is going to be about the Compromise of 1850 and the addition of California to the Union, and it's going to help me understand how these events destabilize the balance, and it's connected back up to the thesis statement about the causes and consequences of the Civil War. So I know exactly what I should be looking for. All of these are flags to the reader. And then of course, in history, as I said at the start of this session, we expect students to evaluate and draw evidence from primary and secondary sources to build that structured argument throughout the essay. So I want to transition now to talking about using quotations for evidence and analysis. And again, I just want to pause. Are there questions? Are there comments? Perhaps things that you might see in your own experiences with history students? Okay, so most of the time our students understand that they have to quote from the reading, but they're not always sure what evidence is most appropriate to quote, and they don't know how. They don't always know the difference between summary and analysis. So they will take a book, this is what I teach with in California History Major Problems, and it's a primary source reader, and they'll know that they should be pulling quotes from the primary sources. But other than copying them into the paper, sometimes they struggle to make that extra step into analysis. So what I encourage them to do is to consider the difference between analysis and summary. Summary, as you know, retells, it paraphrases, right? What the source says. And that's valuable, that's useful for helping us understand sources that are written in historical voices, right? Reading something that an 18th century Spanish Franciscan wrote and translating that into contemporary English is a valuable skill. But you have to take it a step further and explain to the reader why this evidence is significant, what the connection is to the topic at hand, and how it helps build the argument. And you guys have probably heard the sports analogy, right? About summary versus analysis. Or not? Okay. So a writing instructor here at CI shared this with me years ago, and it really stuck with me as a good way to illustrate this, because when I share this in the classroom, their eyes light up and students are like, oh. So if we're thinking about, I don't know, like a broadcast baseball game, and we could say it's the playoffs, and you have the radio announcer, the television announcer, who's up in the media box giving viewers at home or listeners at home a play-by-play of what is happening. Analysis would build on that. So you might, in addition to having that one person summarizing what's happening in the game, you might have someone who branches off and says, okay, the bases are loaded. The Dodgers are down by one, and this next home run could cinch the playoffs and allow them to move on to the World Series. And the pitcher has a shoulder injury and he's looking pretty tired. And, he injured it in game two, but he's back. And you could say, like, and then the batter threw out his knee and he's been missed. You add all this extraneous analysis to explain to the person watching the game why all of these little details matter. You add context. So in the situation with the history paper, students should draw historical context from the topic at hand to explain why all of this matters. Going back to the Civil War example, I could explain that the Compromise of 1850 had followed previous attempts at political compromise about slavery and sectionalism. You could add the context of the gold rush, right? That sped up California's admission. So you add context and you tell the reader why that particular piece of evidence matters, why we should care about it, and how it builds on that thesis. And then I asked students, with these 2 points, does the quote help address the essay prompt and does the quotation support the thesis? And this is always an important question of relevance. Does this really help you? If you have a 5 to 6 page midterm essay, your space is very limited. Students think that's a lot of space, but you all as writers and instructors know that's really not when you start pulling in the evidence. So you have to be very stingy. Or not, stingy is not the right word, discerning. That's a better word. Discerning. Is this the best evidence to help me build a strong argument? Does this quotation, does this evidence help me support the thesis? If the answer is yes, throw it in there. But if it's not, you might want to reconsider. Is there other evidence that is better? Could I pull from a different source? Could I add to this source to strengthen it? And the last thing I'll say is something that I often see in my history students, particularly newer ones, is the tendency to start a paragraph with a quotation, to just dump it in at the start of the paragraph. And I remind them we need that topic sentence, or we need a sentence to introduce that evidence. You are the expert in writing this paper, and your reader is learning from you. So if you don't introduce the quotation and let your reader know why this quotation is important or who's speaking or add some context, you're doing your reader a disservice. Okay. Questions? Are these themes that maybe you've seen come up or you've had to address? Yeah, Jessica.
Yeah, I think for me, when I was taking my history classes, that was the hardest part, was like making those connections and like just like not just quoting and summarizing, or
Yeah,
like the whole
yeah,
analyzing
yeah,
aspect of it. So I think that is one of the parts that I think most students have trouble in. I totally agree. That's
yeah.
has been my experience.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Jessica. And just to validate what you said, I think it's one of the hardest parts of being a history writer. I struggle with it myself. Like I tell my students, your professor's work, you might see it in the published form, but you don't always know how many drafts it took to get to that published form, and how many like bloody, essays with feedback, with wonderful constructive feedback we've gotten from our peers that might say, hey, what's the significance of this evidence here? Can you contextualize it? So we too work on it. It's a very important skill in the discipline that we're developing as undergraduates. And that we really try to hone in on in the capstone. Any other questions or comments? Okay, all right. Favorite topic here. Citation. Uh, This didn't used to be quite so challenging. I'm seeing a lot of hiccups and issues, hiccups and plagiarism happening, and I attribute that to AI, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But just know, I want to reiterate what you know, that the expectation is that history students will cite all evidence, including that which is paraphrased. They should be able to pinpoint exactly where they got a piece of evidence. If they aren't sure if they have to cite it, I encourage them, and I'd ask you to encourage them to ask their professor. We are happy to help. It is our job to meet with students during student hours and to give feedback on their writing, and including drafts. That is part of our job. I would argue working with students is the most important part of our job. So they should always feel free and comfortable to ask for that help from their professors. But I also know that the reality is that we don't always wrap up that draft, right, with enough time to ask the faculty. I'd like to pretend I was a superstar undergrad who finished her work on time, with days ahead. No, I was not. I was finishing it at the last minute, maybe like you did too. If so, in those situations where they don't have time to ask their professor, when in doubt, cite it. It is always better to oversight than to risk plagiarism, especially right now. So when in doubt, cite, oversight if you have to. And then the conventions in the discipline are Chicago style, and I know Dr. Lee is going to go over that with you. In lower division courses, where students tend to have assignments where they analyze what is assigned in class, the convention is often a parenthetical Chicago style citation, usually just the author and the page number. And the reason for this is, if citation is about attributing work to a scholar, the second point of it is to allow your reader to find the source. Well, if it's assigned in class, the professor can easily find it. So in the lower division courses, we're trying to teach students and get them into the practice of learning when you cite and just making that habitual, right? And we make it a little simpler with the parenthetical. In upper division courses, and certainly in assignments that are research projects drawing from the library databases where the professor doesn't know where the source comes from, full footnote or notes, bibliography are expected. And I'll leave that workshop to Dr. Lee. The reminder is for students to, when in doubt, cite it. Cite all evidence, even if you're paraphrasing, and get help if you're not sure. Questions? Is citation something that a lot of students come into your, so you become the experts in, the Chicago style or Turabian, right? This is our best friend. All right, and then AI, and this is an emergent issue in our discipline. We're working on it. We're seeking professional development. Just a few points to keep in mind. Faculty in the history department have varying approaches to AI. I would say that we do not have anyone here who is a heavy AI user. I would say that we are moderate and cautious AI users. I know that we have faculty in our department who might allow it for generating ideas, for proofreading, with the requirement that students cite exactly where they are using it. But for the WMC, I think the question to ask your students is, what is your professor's AI policy? Because it's not uniform. And the second thing I want to talk about is just the general challenges of using AI to the discipline. So I know that I have colleagues on campus who are using AI in really innovative ways in their pedagogy. They might have students use it to help them analyze quantitative data or to summarize case studies, and they're doing awesome work. The trouble with that in the discipline of history there's a few issues that we've seen. First of all, hallucination of evidence. I have had, and of sources. I've had students turn in work in the last 2 semesters where they are claiming that my colleague, Professor Barajas, has written a book. And there's a title that Dr. Barajas has written 2 books. They're both very good books, but that book doesn't exist. It's hallucinated. And, they might argue with me and say like, no, he's down the hall. I know every book he's written. So that's come up where other scholars, books are hallucinated. And because we're subject matters in the field, we know that they're hallucinated sources. So that's just a word of caution. And then we're also seeing issues with factually inaccurate evidence being pulled out of ChatGPT. And I can't remember who it was who spoke at the top of our discussion about the importance of noting who wrote the history. Who was that? Who made that really
that
good?
was me, Alva.
Oh, thank you, Alva. So this is what I wanted to build on with that. So tools like ChatGPT, what we're finding in history is that they're pulling their information from web sources that have had the most traction, the most traffic, or that have been around a long time. The issue with that is that it can pull from books and articles that are outdated. If they're writing back to the presidential election term paper I gave you, if a student pulls sources from ChatGPT about presidential impeachments as a section of their paper on presidential elections, and they pull a monograph from, let's say, 2005, and they, cite the number of impeachments we've had. Well, that's going to be inaccurate, right? Because we've had recent impeachments. There are also issues where, because ChatGPT and the algorithm are pulling from most used or most cited sources, they're not taking into account how those sources have been cited. So, if we were thinking back to the causes of the Civil War, in history, the literature builds on what's previously been written. So perhaps there's a book out there written in the 1950s that argues that the Civil War was not caused by slavery. And perhaps in the decades since then, many historians have cited that book in order to challenge or build upon or contest that argument. But because that book from the 1950s is cited a ton, ChatGPT might think it's a good source and factually accurate. But the reality is scholars have cited it a lot to engage with it and to challenge it. So what we're seeing is that when students pull data and information and evidence from ChatGPT, it's just wrong. I'll be blunt, sometimes it's racist, sometimes it's sexist because it's pulling from the literature that is antiquated and out of date. It's not pulling from the newest publications, which is what we would want our students to do. So it's a big issue. If you could just amplify that point to really try to draw their sources from the library databases and to partner with the research librarians, go down to the big circle desk and ask for help, ask your professors for help to avoid those problems with AI. And then the last 2 points are we're seeing a loss of critical thinking skills when students rely on the AI. And it's a problem because in history, to write is to think. We use writing as exercise in processing and analyzing and critical thinking. So the loss of that, we're struggling with how to address it while acknowledging that AI is a valuable tool for students. So we're, again, seeking professional development and we're learning alongside you guys. Okay, and then just mechanics and clarity. I think you guys are experts on this. But I encourage my students to get into the practice of editing and proofreading on their own, in addition to going to you, but to make that a habitual practice, particularly the last points down here, because writing is development for their future careers. And I want my future teachers to be able to write parent newsletters and emails to principals and administrators that are free of errors and are clear and cogent. So it's training for their careers, and this is an adaptable skill, right? Writing is adaptable and transferable. Will stay with them forever. All right, so any questions, any comments? Yeah, Emma.
This isn't a question as much as just a comment, but I think the part where you were talking about like the importance of topic sentences is definitely something that I've seen definitely across disciplines, but especially whenever I encounter a history paper. Because a lot of the time, like you said, they'll just kind of go in with a quote, or they'll just be like, this is my evidence, and this is like I'm like the expert on it. And it's like, okay, can we take a second and kind of ease your reader into this a little bit? So I think you emphasizing that point was definitely something I noticed, important to note.
Thanks, Emma, for sharing that. I'm glad to hear, or not glad, but it's good to know that it comes up in meetings with you all too.
I have a question kind of about the types of evidence you use. So I know that the quotations are important, but I was wondering, because you mentioned paraphrasing as well. I know certain disciplines, like for APA style, they don't want you to use direct quotations at all. They'd prefer everything paraphrased. Is there like some guidance with that? Should it be like, is there a preference for quotations, or is it context dependent?
I would say it's context dependent. So if you are quoting, say, a voice from the past, you're quoting a diary of a Chinese miner during the gold rush. You want to let that historical voice speak for himself. There's power in that. If you are quoting, and that said, historians were very stylistic. We like our writing to be, we're storytellers, right? So we get really nitpicky about style, and I'm not expecting students to write as do published authors, but we're developing them. Some go to grad school. So I like to get them into the habit of varying it up. So if they're going to use, let's say, statistical data on the number of deaths and casualties during the Civil War from a secondary source, maybe you could paraphrase that, and just attribute the data to that source. So it's definitely contextual, but it's not like APA where there's strict conventions around that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jessica.
There's been every time when we have a student come in for a history class and it's Chicago notes bib, um, we're always debating, should they use Word or can they use Google Doc? Because I know in Google Docs they can't technically correctly do all the citations. I don't know if you guys are like super picky on that.
I'm not in my own
Okay.
classes. I've had students, what's the issue with Google Docs? Because I've used footnotes and
I think the footnotes aren't correct, something like that with like the sizing of it.
So what's happening is that when you use Google Docs, the footnote is not superscript. It's superscripts. It doesn't go back to the default, and you can't edit that part of it. But I just led a workshop actually on Notesbib, and some of you guys were there. Alba was there for sure, and the online Word document that students can access, it's free for everybody here, allows for you to do that kind of editing. So if you really are into the formatting of Chicago style with the unsuperscripted number at the very bottom of the notes, right? Then Word is really the only way to go. I already looked at the Google Docs. There's no way you can change that formatting. But again, like for undergraduates, since or the lower division courses, they're doing author date. That's not going to be an issue. I think for the upper division, depending on maybe faculty, if they're really strict about it. We're just training. I was training our tutors to use the online Word because it's accessible to everybody and they can use it that way. Yeah.
Thanks for that context. I had no idea. Now that you mention it, yeah, I've had some papers where the font size is a little wonky, but
Yeah.
it doesn't bother me, but I can't speak for all my colleagues. You know,
Mhm.
everyone's different. I can't, yeah, that's good to know. There are other questions or topics I can address for y'all? If things ever come up, I'll just pop my email in the chat. You're welcome to contact me anytime. And I'm on the history website. I'm the chair. So again, I'm so grateful for all the work you all do. I can really see the difference when students make use of the amazing resource that is the WMC. So just thank you.